From the world of politics.
Diplomacy is going nowhere unless we have leverage. And the way you get leverage is by, frankly, going in and killing Russians. That's what the Ukrainians have to do.
To the world of business.
The most important is for the Fed to stay nimble in a situation that is evolving so quickly for workers, for consumers.
This is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Well, the subject, once again, is Ukraine. And the focus today is in Washington and in Beijing, and that call that happened for about an hour and 50 minutes between President Biden of the United States and President Xi of China. To bring us up to speed on what we know, and for that matter, what we don't know entirely, and we turn now to Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government. Emily, thank you so much for being here. As I say, I think we know how long it lasted. Other than that, I think we're only getting one side so far.
Yeah, at this point, we do not have the White House readout of the call, so certainly we'll be developing when that comes out, sort of compare the two statements against each other. But what we do know, at least from the China side readout of the call, is that Xi was very adamant that China does not want to see violence in Ukraine. They want to have a good relationship with the United States. Really, though, David, the big concern going in here, something that White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki made sure to highlight the other day, was the fact that China has yet to really condemn Russia for this invasion. And the White House does believe that Russia and China are getting a little bit closer, that Xi and the Kremlin could be forming a little bit more of an alliance. Of course, the question is, how does that wind up playing out? Do we see military assistance from Beijing go to Moscow and then therefore into Ukraine? That's something that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken raised as a concern the other day. Another thing to look out for, does China wind up trying to find ways to help relieve sanctions on Russia? And the message that we know that President Biden delivered today was that if China does either of those things, that there will be sanctions on China, and just urging China to really stay neutral in this situation.
Yeah, terribly important. At the same time, as you suggest, there are a lot of questions left. Thank you so much to Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government. We turn now to somebody who knows the United States and its government and also knows Beijing and its government terribly well. He's Gary Locke, former U.S. Ambassador to China, also former Secretary of Commerce in Washington and former governor of the state of Washington. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being back with us. There's a lot we don't know about this. What is the best that the United States could hope for out of this discussion today?
Well, thank you very much, David. I think the best that America can hope for is that, first of all, China does not provide any type of military or economic assistance to Russia, and that it second of all, calls for diplomacy and a cessation, a stand down of the military action by the Russians. China's in a bit of a pickle. First of all the images of the travesty, the devastation, the human toll and the suffering within Ukraine is actually being broadcast throughout China. And China has, up until recently, actually within recent weeks, has been reinforcing the message that it respects the territorial integrity of other nations. And China has actually recognized the government of Ukraine. So the longer this conflict goes on, the more the Chinese people will be wondering where its own government stands and why they are not trying to bring a halt to the suffering.
Ambassador Locke, you know China, and you know particularly, I think, President Xi well, in the sense that I believe you were ambassador there in Beijing when he came to power. Can you give us a sense from his point of view right now, where are the Chinese interests? What's the interest of China in backing Russia on the one hand? What's the interest on the other hand of not backing it all the way?
Well, China has long been an ally and a partner with Russia. Of course, they've formed diplomatic relations with the United States to try to break some of those ties and to be more independent of Russian influence, but they are still fundamentally aligned. And they have a very significant economic interest, but not as much as it has with the West and certainly the United States. Now, Russia counts on China as a major trading partner. Much of its income comes from trade and exports to China, but China depends more on economic ties with the European Union, and with America. And so it's very concerned about risking those economic ties, the source of jobs for the Chinese people, the source of income for the Chinese companies, if it were to somehow run afoul of the West and the United States and be the subject of sanctions if it were to provide any assistance to Russia.
Mr. Ambassador, coming out of this, is it likely that we will become closer to China or more separated from them?
I don't think we will become closer. Certainly, we have many deep-seated issues with China over trade, its economic policies, enforcement of intellectual property, human rights, and an independent judiciary. So relations between the United States and China are perhaps at an all-time low. Nonetheless, there are many, many areas of cooperation where our two sides are working together, whether it's fighting climate change, finding cures for some of the most dreaded diseases, and in fact, trying to stop global terrorism. China and the United States have partnered and continue to partner on some of these issues. But it's very perhaps siloed in many areas. And we need to find a way in which we can come together, respect our differences, be very firm about U.S. positions on things like human rights, but find a way to work together. And certainly this is an opportunity with respect to the crisis in Ukraine for the United States and China and the world community to firmly condemn the actions of Russia.
Ambassador Locke, you mentioned trade, and thus far, I don't believe I've seen a comprehensive approach to trade from the Biden administration. Certainly, we knew what President Trump was trying to do with China. It's not quite as clear that the Biden administration has been articulate about that. Is that an opportunity here? Are there opportunities here to use trade in a way to open things up and, yes, to cajole or even put pressure on China to be more firm with Russia?
Well, that is a possibility, and I'm sure that the two sides, China and America, have been talking about how to remove the tariffs. But the problem is that, excuse me, China has not lived up to many of its commitments that it made to President Trump. And so I think the administration would be hard pressed to relax some of those tariffs, which ultimately, unfortunately, are hurting American consumers because the tariffs imposed on Chinese goods are not paid for by the Chinese government. They're paid for by the people who pick up those supplies, shoes, clothes, hardware, sporting goods at the docks of American ports. And so that has actually increased the cost for American consumers, especially in a time of high inflation. So I'm sure the Biden administration would somehow like to lower those tariffs, but only if there's concrete actions taken by the Chinese government to address the deep-seated, long-standing concerns of not just America, but our Western allies with respect to China's trade and economic policies. Now, perhaps if China really helps out, condemns Russia, certainly does not purchase Russian goods to relieve the fact that Russia cannot sell many of its products now to Europe, whether it's oil, natural gas, and agricultural outputs or technology, that might be a factor in the Biden administration re-examining the tariffs on Chinese goods.
Ambassador Locke, there is speculation that President Putin did not anticipate the United States and its NATO allies would be able to move forward with this degree of unanimity and this swiftness. I wonder, from your experience in Beijing, how does that factor really cause reaction in Beijing? Are they paying a lot of attention to how unified we are right now?
Very much so. I think that both China and Russia did not feel that the United States and its allies in Europe would take very swift, very decisive, comprehensive, and far-reaching countermeasures, such as the sanctions, basically the banning of purchases of Russian materials and goods, and especially cutting off Russia from the international financial system. That is going to really impact the everyday lives of the Russian people and businesses. And I think China is really seeing, wow, the United States and the European allies are very united, acting very decisively, and that's why it has to be concerned about assisting Russia. Will the West and the United States also take very firm, decisive, swift actions against Chinese companies and the Chinese government?
Ambassador Locke, I want to leave on a question we received from a viewer as we've been talking here, and that's about Taiwan. I think sometimes in the United States, we underestimate how important, how central Taiwan is to the Chinese psyche. Do you anticipate that in these talks at all, China would try to link Taiwan to what's going on here?
No, I don't think there'll be any linkage in the talks between the United States and China about Taiwan. But clearly, what the West is doing with respect to sanctions in response to Russia's military actions is certainly being noticed by the Chinese leaders with respect to any type of actions they might want to take toward Taiwan.
Okay, thank you so very much. It's always a delight to talk with you. That's Ambassador Gary Locke, former U.S. Ambassador to China. Coming up here, Ethan Harris of Bank of America on where the Fed goes from here. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton with First Word.
David, thank you. Chinese leader Xi Jinping assured President Biden that his country did not want war in Ukraine during a 2-hour video conference this morning. It was the two leaders' first conversation since Russia's invasion last month. Xi told Mr. Biden that the invasion, quote, isn't what we want to see, end quote. That's according to a report from state-run news. And a top aide to Ukraine's President Zelensky says the aim of peace talks with Russia should be to stop the fighting now. Ihor Jokva spoke to Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo.
If you have the serious diplomatic talks, you immediately implement the ceasefire. Just to remind you, when they started the first round of negotiations on the level of delegations, they promised to have a ceasefire, which was not the case during the first, second, third, and already fourth round of negotiations. Yes, ceasefire should be implemented immediately.
Mr. Jokva says the lack of a ceasefire shows that Russia isn't serious about finding a diplomatic solution. Only half of Chinese aged 80 years and older are fully vaccinated. That's a challenge as the country faces its worst COVID-19 outbreak since Wuhan. Health officials in Beijing say about 51% of over 80-year-olds have gotten 2 shots and around 20% have boosters, while nearly 88% of China's 1.4 billion people have their 2 shots. The numbers decline with age. Dr. Anthony Fauci is warning that the United States could soon see COVID-19 cases rise again. He also says vulnerable people are likely to need a 4th vaccine dose. The government's infectious diseases chief tells Bloomberg that a case spike similar to the one in the UK is likely to happen in the United States. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, investors and markets continue to react to that Fed action on Wednesday of this week, not always in the same direction. At the same time, we're starting to hear from some Fed presidents, regional Fed presidents today, really taking the hawkish side of the message, as it were. Welcome now, Ethan Harris, Bank of America Head of Global Economic Research. Ethan, thank you so much for being with us. Give us your take on what the Fed did and what it means potentially for the U.S. economy.
Well, we've been waiting for the Fed to capitulate on this policy they've had. It doesn't make sense to have a 0 interest rate with this kind of inflation and with this rapid a drop in the unemployment rate. And so I was very encouraged by what the Fed did this week. They've now moved to, if you look at their dot plot, they've now got basically the same outlook for Fed policy as we have had all along here. 7 hikes this year and another 3 or 4 next year. And I think it's important that they've gotten moving here. I do think the natural course for the Fed is to hike 25 basis points per meeting. I think they will only go 50 if they're kind of nudged into it, if the inflation picture doesn't improve significantly. This idea that they would do 50 out of the gate, I never understood. They want to gather more data, But there's a decent risk, and I think the hawks are right, there's a decent risk that they have to do 50 at some point later this year.
Well, up to that point, Mr. Bullard that we heard from this morning said the reason he dissented is because he would have done 50 then, as well as starting to really the quantitative tightening. And then we also have Mr. Waller coming out and said he thinks that you do 50 the next time. One of the things I'm curious about, though, is do the numbers add up for you as an economist? Because they basically said inflation, yes, it's going to be worse than we originally anticipated. There's going to be less growth. We're going to raise rates faster than we had thought. And by the way, we will not affect unemployment. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't. You know, you can't have a painless battle against inflation. You have to slow the economy down. And the real question for the Fed is this enough? Is it enough to raise the funds rate to 3%? Does that give you enough weakness in the economy to at least stop the drop in the unemployment rate, if not push it up? Or do they have to go further and actually deliberately cause a sharp slowing in growth? So maybe a zero growth economy in 23 or 24. So it doesn't make sense to talk about a painless withdrawal strategy. Inflation's here. It's not entirely transitory. The Fed has to impose at least some level of pain.
Well, let's go to that very point. I talked to Larry Summers earlier today. We'll hear from him a little bit later on. And he made the basic point, listen, if you're going to try to bring down inflation, you have to have your rates higher than the inflation rate. And the inflation rate that they're projecting is more than 1% or 2%. It's quite substantial. It could be 5%, 6%. So what does that say about the rates that they're going to have to get us to in order to really discourage the inflation?
Well, we know that there's a big temporary component to the inflation. So the real question isn't whether it's temporary, it's how much is permanent. I mean, if inflation on its own, without the Fed really hitting the brakes hard, drops below 3% in the next couple of years, I think the Fed will basically declare victory there, even though it's a little high relative to what they'd like to see. If it doesn't come down below 3, they can't argue that they're modestly overshooting. And at that point, the Larry Summers scenario where they really hit the brakes hard and the risk of recession becomes quite high, if it can't get it below 3 with the kind of natural reopening process, and then they're going to have to go to Plan B and do some of the dirty work themselves.
Ethan, what about the recession possibility? There could be an argument that, in fact, it's better to go higher earlier when the economy is pretty strong rather than to put it off till later, because most people project that growth is going to be slowing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, you know, my job's to forecast what the Fed will do and not what I think they should do. I would have, had I been a voter there, I would have been going for 50 basis point hike. They had an opportunity to hike 50 basis point without shocking the markets, but they spent the last couple months dissuading the markets from a 50 basis point move. So they've demonstrated that they really do not want to do 50, and the middle of the committee needs to be convinced by the hawks before they'll go. The good news on the recession risk is that this year the recession risk is quite low. You have an economy that has tremendous momentum, pent-up demand in many sectors. The economy can afford some cooling off in the year ahead. The bigger concern comes next year if and when inflation fails to come down below 3%. Now you're talking about a world where you presumably still have high oil prices. You have a Fed getting tough rather than moving to neutral. Now you're talking real risk of recession. So I don't think it's a short-run risk. I think it's a concern for next year.
Okay, Ethan, always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for the time. That's Ethan Harris of Bank of America. Still to come, we're going to hear from former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers on how he grades the Fed's performance. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
Bloomberg has the Fed covered all next week. Monday, live coverage of Chairman Jay Powell speaking at the NABE Economic Policy Conference in Washington, D.C.
We do feel the economy is very strong.
Then, additional Fed president interviews throughout the week.
Markets are going to have to price that risk.
Balance sheet policy is just another part of our policy toolkit.
The most in-depth coverage and analysis of the Fed.
Which meeting matters? Every meeting matters.
Starting Monday on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. It's been a sort of wild couple of weeks here in the markets with them all over the place, whether you're talking about commodities or bonds or equities or anything else. To take us through where we are this week as we've gotten into the last trading of the week, welcome now Abigail Doolittle. So where are we?
Well, it looks like we're in a risk-on area here. We're looking at the best week for the S&P 500 and the other stock indexes going back to November of 2020. That, of course, was around the time of the election, so that real buying power. And, you know, you could say that it has to do with some sentiment around the Russia-Ukraine war, but I would argue that it has more so to do with getting the Fed out of the way. That was a big, gorilla on the back of investors. They now know that the Fed held to what they said that they were going to do. And at this point, it's seen as being either just in line, or I would even say that there's reason to think it's being seen as dovish.
Well, in fact, if you look at the markets, do they even believe that the Fed's going to be at 2.25 by the end of next year?
That's an interesting point. The WERP function in the Bloomberg, I believe, suggests that it will, but I think that it's going to be with some, and I don't know that for sure because I could pull that up right now. But in terms of the yields themselves, it looks like there could be some bumpiness ahead. And if you think about the balance sheet, there's some banks saying that they're going to be very gentle in terms of the runoff. So to your point around, will they actually hike? I think the 7 times that are being priced in. Let's find out.
Well, considering we have this major shift from loosening to tightening, the markets actually, after an initial blip, settled right back down again, both equities and bonds.
Well, here's the thing. This year, the S&P 500 at one point down more than 10%, the NASDAQ down 20%. So really kind of priced in for some sort of worst case scenario of ultra hawkish. But I think that investors are getting a little bit more used to the idea that the Fed really is going to do everything they can. A lot of people saying they're not going to be able to do this, but everything they can to produce some sort of a soft landing. So this week you have what looks like a dovish reaction. You have the dollar down. You have bonds down a little bit, so that's not exactly dovish, but well off the 225 highs around the time of the Fed meeting. You have stocks up, and there's reason to think, David, today, of course, is triple witching. The volatility this week may have something to do with that. It's a large expiration. Maybe that carries into next week.
And on top of everything, we thought there might well be a default coming on the Russian bonds, and right now, maybe not so much.
Maybe not so much. And what's so interesting to me about this is that there's been a lot of attention paid to these Russian bonds, but when you consider that's 117 million, that's almost nothing relative to the dollars that we're usually talking about. It was psychological. It's a key symbolic around what's happening right now. The fact that Treasury is saying that the sanctions against Russia doesn't mean that they can't pay this debt. That's important. It tells you that some of the wiring within diplomacy and within the financial markets of the world, it's still working.
So the market seems to be adjusting to all the...
Very quickly.
All that's going on in the
volatility. The VIX, which had been at almost 40 last week, it's below 25. Looks like it's going back to 20. So investors... Wow. It's been a wild ride, but investors seem to be getting used to all these different factors they have to deal with.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that read on the markets. Coming up, supplying arms to Ukraine with former Undersecretary of Defense Dov Zakheim. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. European stocks about to finish the day and the week. Let's talk about the price action that we're seeing right now as we come into the close. Basically flat. We've had a fairly muted session here in Europe relative to recent performances. So what are we looking at? The FTSE 100 up by 0.2%. The CAC 40 in Paris absolutely dead flat. Similar story down there in Madrid. Similar story in Milan. The DAX in Germany down by 0.1%. What does that translate into when it comes to the Stock 600? Let's take a quick look and show you what the session looks like as we come through towards the end of the week. As you can see, really a tale of two halves. Certainly this afternoon, we've climbed back into positive territory. It's interesting that it's not the main markets that have been driving today's performance. It's been the peripheral markets. That's why we're seeing the Stock 600 up by around 0.8%, continuing to climb. It's amazing. It has been a really solid week for European equities. We're up really quite nicely, 453.94, nearly 454 on the European markets, the Stock 600 at least. I think this takes us to a really interesting kind of position, which is take a look at where we are on the Stock 600 since February the 24th. What happened on the 24th? Of course, that was the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And this is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. The initial reaction down, understandable. But since then, equities have really regained their footing on both sides of the Atlantic. And since the Russian invasion started,
European equities are actually higher. We're up by 3.5%. If you'd have told people that just a few days back, I think they'd have been amazed. But certainly this climb over the last couple of sessions, certainly the last couple of weeks, has been really quite amazing. So that's kind of where we stand. We're positive since the Russian invasion. Clearly, we're down on the year thus far. In terms of the stocks and the sectors that have been driving us this week, let me just show you what has been going on the GRR. This is set to 5 days, so that gives you a 5-day performance. Financial services, technology, media, the car sector, banks, travel and leisure, the luxury sector, industrial goods. All these sectors are higher. In fact, there are only 2 sectors that are in negative territory this week. The commodity sectors. Basic resources, the miners, down by 0.3%. The energy sector, down by 0.5%. Incredible volatility, though, continues in the energy markets. And the expectation is, certainly talking to the market participants that I've been having conversations with, the expectation is that that volatility with energy, how to price a molecule, how to price a barrel of oil, is likely to continue. But that's the picture on the week. Higher on the week, higher since the 24th, driven by all those sectors. The only drags, the commodities. David, back to you.
Thank you so much, Guy. It's nice to see Europe ending the week on an up note. Thanks so much for that report. In the meantime, let's come back to that question of Ukraine, which has dominated so much of the news this week. And one of the concerns has been if we supply, the United States and allies supply more weapons to Ukraine, will it be provocative to Russia? Will it provoke something that's a larger conflagration? Earlier this week, we spoke with a former defense secretary, he's William Cohen, and asked him, should we be worried about provoking Russia? This is part of what he had to say.
Frankly, I'm kind of tired of the Russia telling us what is provocative when they're slamming artillery shells into residential buildings and saying what we can use, what we can't use, and give to the Ukrainians to defend themselves.
We welcome now another veteran of the Defense Department. He is Dov Zakheim. He was Undersecretary of Defense under President George W. Bush. Now he is Senior Advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So, Dov, thank you so much for being with us. I have a suspicion that you may tend to agree with Mr. Cohen.
More than tend to agree. I fully agree. Bill's absolutely right. What we've been doing, and it's a huge mistake on our part, is essentially deterring ourselves. We keep talking, the president's talked about World War III. I think Jen Psaki's talked about World War III. What a mistake. That gives Putin leverage. He can then threaten, he'll go to nuclear weapons, he'll nuke us, whatever, and it'll stop us from helping the Ukrainians. The truth of the matter is there may be a good case for not sending them aircraft. I don't agree, but General Todd Walters, who is the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, the commander of our forces in Europe, he doesn't think it'll help him much. Now, the president of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, thinks it'll help him a lot. But there are other weapons as well. We're not sending Patriots. We say it'll take too long to train. I don't know that it would. I don't think the Ukrainians think it would. We're not really sending all the things they've asked for. And, what does it take? The president of Ukraine goes to Congress and says, I need all this stuff. And we say, well, it'll cause World War III. Well, why would it cause World War III? Does Mr. Putin want to blow up his entire country in a nuclear war? It's not going to help him build a Russian empire, that's for sure.
So that's about armaments. What about the no-fly zone? Do you agree with President Biden on that really could have a direct conflict, an armed conflict between U.S. forces, NATO forces on one hand, and Russian on the other?
Well, I'm not as enthusiastic about a no-fly zone. It seems to me that if we were to provide the Ukrainians both with aircraft and with high-level air defense systems to knock their aircraft out of the sky, then you'd effectively have a kind of no-fly zone. Why should we take on Russian jets directly? The Ukrainians can do a pretty good job themselves.
So you also written, Mr. Zakheim, about the possibility of creative diplomacy. We talked with another former Secretary of Defense, he's Leon Panetta, yesterday, about what needs to be done to really make progress on the diplomatic front. This is what he had to say about that.
Make no mistake about it. Diplomacy is going nowhere unless we have leverage, unless the Ukrainians have leverage. And the way you get leverage is by, frankly, going in and killing Russians. This is a power game. Putin understands power. He really doesn't understand diplomacy very much. He understands power.
Dov, do you agree with that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, Leon knows his way around, that's for sure. And the fact of the matter is that Putin will not. I wrote a whole bunch of things that we could do. A Ukraine under a kind of Austrian state treaty that makes it neutral. the Donbass, those two breakaway republics that go back to Ukraine but are treated the way the Kurds are treated in Iraq, semi-independent. Yes, there are things that can be sorted out, but they're not going to get sorted out until Putin, and it's only Putin, that realizes he can't win this war. Now, how does he realize he can't win this war? Back to what I said earlier, back to what Bill Cohen said earlier. We supply the Ukrainians, they keep fighting, and Putin keeps losing people. And at some point, he realizes this just isn't working out.
How do we know, this may even be a little bit funny, how do we know when President Putin is serious about actually a diplomatic solution? Because he's now said this week, they said, well, we might be open to a neutral Ukraine along the lines perhaps of what you described with Austria. But a lot of people thought that was really just a misdirection. How do we know when President Putin is serious?
We'll know when they make a formal offer. You know, they are negotiating with the Ukrainians. When they make a formal offer, and they will only make a formal offer when they stop shooting. The key to a deal is that they stop shooting. Until they stop shooting, there's no deal. They're just going to keep on fighting and fighting and grabbing more land and blowing up more apartment houses, hospitals, and opera houses, for God's sake. And they'll talk. So the talk doesn't mean a thing until the shooting stops. And the shooting isn't the Ukrainians who have to stop, it's the Russians.
I've learned from experts like you that in a protracted conflict, logistics play an awfully large role. Give us your sense of logistics on the two sides. On the one hand, whatever we want to supply to Ukrainians, whether it's S-300s or it's Patriots or whether it's armed drones, we have to be able to get it to them. What is the risk that Russia can cut that off? And on the flip side, how are we doing, and how are the Ukrainians, more importantly, doing in really stopping the supplies to Russians?
Well, it looks like the Russians are having trouble. They can't even feed their people. They're simply extended, and that's partly because Mr. Putin believed there would be if I could use the quote, a slam dunk. He thought he'd get in there in a few days and they'd welcome him with open arms. So they simply didn't prepare the logistical support they needed to. And the Ukrainians are still blowing things up that make it much more difficult to supply the forces. And that's leaving aside the fact of morale. And nobody talks too much about that, but you can't win a war without morale. And who's got the morale? The Ukrainians are fighting for their homeland. These Russian kids don't even know why they're there. And a lot of them are not fighting. On the Ukrainian side, of course, it's not going to be easy to get everything in, but we're managing and we're going to continue to manage. And as long as the Ukrainians are able to keep the skies over the areas that the transfers are taking place, keep those skies clear, which I think they're doing up to now, those transfers will continue. So I think the Russians, frankly, probably have as big a logistics problem as the Ukrainians, maybe a bigger one.
Fascinating. Mr. Zakheim, really good to have you with us. Thank you for your time. That's Dov Zakheim. He's former Undersecretary of the Department of Defense. Coming up here, he's been asking for the Fed to raise rates. Is former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers satisfied? We find out next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. In the wake of the Fed's move toward tightening this week, we talked with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers about whether he thinks it has done enough.
I think they're recognizing that they're behind the curve. I think they've still got a long way to go. They've got a long way to go in forecasting realistically. I just don't believe that it is plausible that we're going to have 3 years of 3.5% unemployment while inflation falls precipitously. Nor do I believe that inflation is likely to fall precipitously on a path where the nominal interest rate never gets within 2 percentage points of where the inflation rate is right now, not at any point in the next 3 years. I also think that the Fed needs to recognize that its 2020 framework was perhaps a good idea in the deflationary context of that moment, though I'm not sure it was, but it is surely not got anything connected with our current kinds of challenges. So Perhaps institutions adjust with some gradualism, so perhaps we're moving in the right direction. But I think there's a long way to go, and I don't think the Fed has really done all that will be necessary to preserve its credibility in the face of the substantial inflation that I think is likely to come to us in recent months. You know, I just had a chance to review what is the best data on wages, the data from the Atlanta Fed. And depending on which of the indices you use, how you weight the data and so forth, on some measures, wage inflation is now getting close to 7%. And that is just not consistent with the kind of places that we want to go in terms of inflation.
That was Larry Summers of Harvard. We'll have the complete interview tonight on Wall Street Week at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, where Larry will be joined by Rick Reeder of BlackRock. Coming up here, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson has her Supreme Court confirmation hearings next week. We go over what to expect with law professor Tara Leigh Grove of the University of Alabama. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Next week, there's 4 days of hearings in the Senate Judiciary Committee for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson for her nomination to the United States Supreme Court. To set the stage for us, we welcome now Professor Tara Leigh Grove of the University of Alabama Law School. So, Professor, thanks so much for being back with us. What are we expecting to happen? What should happen?
Right. So thank you for having me. Judge Jackson has been meeting with senators one-on-one this week, which is pretty common when someone gets nominated to the United States Supreme Court. They have these one-on-one meetings with senators just so the senators can get to know them. And next week, Judge Jackson will start the public hearings. And so people will be able to see her interactions with the Senate. And this will be with the Senate Judiciary Committee. The first day should just be opening statements by the senator, maybe by some of Judge Jackson's close supporters, close friends, and by Judge Jackson herself. And then in the subsequent days, we'll probably see senators questioning her about a range of issues.
Well, so what are the issues here as a practical matter? We know a lot about her. She has quite a remarkable record in the case of having been in private practice, having been a public defender, but also having worked for some big law firms, having been a trial court judge, district court judge, and now for a short time in the Court of Appeals. She's got a pretty extensive record. What are the questions about it?
So typically, senators want to know what they call the Supreme Court nominee's judicial philosophy. How will this nominee approach constitutional interpretation? How will this nominee approach statutory interpretation? How does this nominee think about judging? As you note, Judge Jackson has been a judge for quite some time, so we have a pretty good sense of her approach to judging. But that typically tends to be the questions. I will say, I think many people say it's just kabuki theater. We don't actually learn very much from the nominee. And in recent confirmation hearings, nominees haven't said a lot about how they will rule in particular cases, and they shouldn't, right? Like judges should not say how they might rule either in particular cases or in particular contexts. So that makes a lot of sense. But we can still get a good sense of how much the judge knows about the law, and Judge Jackson knows a tremendous amount. So I think we'll get a sense of her familiarity with a wide variety of areas of law. I also think the confirmation hearings are interesting because of the questions the senators ask. I think we learn as much about the United States senators and their familiarity with constitutional law and other areas of law as we do about the nominees themselves.
So judicial philosophy, I understand. Judicial temperament certainly is something that's really important on any court, and specifically on the Supreme Court. At the same time, we now see some people in the Senate raising questions about some of the defendants that this judge represented when she was a public defender. Is that fair game? I mean, that someone was a criminal defender and represented some people who perhaps ended up getting convicted, as many people do. Should that be counted against them?
I think the fact that Judge Jackson was a public defender should count in her favor. because this is the kind of experience that very few members of the Supreme Court have had, certainly in a very long time. The last public defender was Thurgood Marshall, or former public defender was Thurgood Marshall. And this offers a perspective on the US Supreme Court that I think is quite valuable. There are lots of people who have been former prosecutors who have turned into judges. I think there's real value in having someone who has been on the other side. And the reality is we have a zealous advocacy system. This is what lawyers do. Lawyers represent their clients and try to do it to the best of their ability. And so if one is a public defender, one is going to be defending people who may be accused of having done some terrible things. And that's the job. You give them the best representation possible, and that's what makes the system work. So no, I don't think it's fair game to criticize her for what her clients may or may not have done.
Professor, it's in my experience impossible to know what a person will do once they're on the Supreme Court. They're appointed for life, and they often end up different than you think. But just speculate here a little bit. What difference do you think potentially could Judge Jackson make on the Supreme Court? People are saying, look, it's not going to change the tilt, the balance between so-called left, so-called right. At the same time, she will be the first black woman ever on the Supreme Court if she is in fact confirmed.
So I think on some of the major issues like abortion or gun rights, Judge Jackson will not differ tremendously in her votes from Justice Breyer. There may be some areas, I think criminal law is one of them, where her votes will actually differ from Justice Breyer, or could differ. But in many areas, they won't. It'll still be what people view as a 6-3 super conservative majority on the Supreme Court. I actually think it matters a lot to have different perspectives in the discussions themselves. We don't know what the Supreme Court's discussions look like. Those are always in closed secrecy. Even the law clerks can't be in the room. Even other workers of the Supreme Court can't be in the room. But I think it's valuable to have people with different experiences as part of those discussions, because the reality is we all look at the law and issues from our own background experiences, and people with different experiences can help others see things in a different way. I encourage my students to talk to other students just to get a sense of, well, how do you see this issue? Because we all see things differently. And I think the discussions can be valuable, even if some of the votes at the end of the day turn out to be the same.
And it's not irrelevant that she is relatively young. I mean, because it used to be that justices were appointed well into their 60s, maybe even well into their 60s, and had a relatively short time in the court. There's an increasing trend, it would seem, and this is for Republican nominees as well as Democrats, to appoint people who are much younger. They'll be there a long time, presumably, we hope.
And so there will be no immediate change in the Supreme Court. There could be a long-term change in the U.S. Supreme Court because Judge Jackson will be there a long time. We don't know what's going to happen to the Supreme Court in the next 5 or 10 years. But even if one expects Judge Jackson to be the minority on the minority of votes on certain issues right now, that could change in the next 10 or 20 years, and she'll still be there influencing the discussion and the decision-making.
You are, of course, a Supreme Court scholar. You're not a politician, at least that I'm aware of. And this is, to some extent, a political question. But do you have any doubt that she'll be confirmed, whatever process they go through next week?
Right now, I have no doubt that she will be confirmed. And this is based in part of the fact that Judge Jackson was confirmed to the D.C. Circuit by the same Senate. One would assume that she's likely to be confirmed to the Supreme Court. So I think also because the immediate stakes seem lower than with some of the recent nominations, because Judge Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court will not change the current conservative liberal, or what is perceived as a conservative liberal balance.
Fascinating. One last quick one here. Do you think the process is any better for taking 4 days rather than half a day? My old boss, Justice Powell, I think was there for half a day.
I think it's a really tough question. I have talked to many judges as well as other folks who study these issues, and actually think the closed hearings where the nominee is questioned about issues related to security or an FBI investigation, this is commonplace. The closed hearings are more valuable because they're not public. I will say, I think, as I said, that there's value in seeing what the senators themselves view as important. And I think the public learns a lot about the U.S. Senate through these confirmation hearings, and I hope that will provide some value.
That's a really good point. Thank you so much, Professor. That's Tara Leigh Grove of the University of Alabama. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to the head of Radio Free Europe. And this is Bloomberg.